Next on The Impossible State, economic security, supply chains, and U.S. Korea economic cooperation with the new Trump administration. Stay tuned.
North Korea is the impossible state. It's a place that stumped leaders and policymakers for more than 3 decades. It has a complex history, and it has become the United States' top national security priority. Each week on this show, we'll talk with the people who know the most about North Korea.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to another episode of the Impossible State podcast. I'm your host, Victor Cha, President of Geopolitics and Foreign Policy and Korea Chair at CSIS and Professor at Georgetown University. And today we're going to be talking about economic security, supply chains, and U.S.-Korea economic cooperation with the new Trump administration. And joining us today is Professor Lee Hyo-young, who is currently Associate Professor at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. So for those of you who don't know, the Korea National Diplomatic Academy is something akin to the Foreign Service Institute here in Washington, D.C., or actually in Virginia, that trains foreign service officers. And the National Diplomatic Academy does basically the same thing in Korea. Dr. Lee is an associate professor there teaching on international trade and diplomacy. Before Dr. Lee, and you've been at KNDA since 2017, I think,
yes.
Right? And before that, you worked as a research fellow at the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, otherwise known as KIEP, in the Division of International Trade, during which time you were also, it looks like you're seconded as an Assistant Director for Trade, Industry, and Energy to the Presidential Office from 2014 to 2015. Dr. Lee obtained her PhD in International Studies from Seoul National University, that very famous school at Georgetown of South Korea, I was going to say, and majoring in international law and international trade law and policy. So like we talked about, we're going to be talking about questions of economic security and supply chains. And so I know this is an area you're very well versed in. It's not a topic we often cover on The Impossible State, which often is a focus on North Korea. So maybe at the start, Dr. Lee, if you could just walk us through sort of what are when we think about sort of economic security issues in Korea, what are the main things that sort of top the list when we talk about economic security issues?
Yes. Well, first of all, one of the top economic security issues for the Korean government is stabilizing Korea's critical supply chains, especially with regard to critical minerals for key sectors. So minimizing supply chain risks involving these supply of critical minerals is a key top priority economic security issue. And the second top priority issue would be protecting while at the same time promoting the key strategic, especially technology sectors in Korea, because it directly relates to the competitiveness of the Korean economic sector. And so we need to be increasingly aware of the security risks of technology leakage, while at the same time we need to promote the technology advancement to maintain competitiveness. And last but not least, another issue that we need to think about in terms of economic security is addressing the risks of global climate change and energy security as well, because climate change risks are not going away in the long term, and we need to address them not only at the domestic level, but also at the global level, because if they are not addressed, they will eventually become domestic economic security issues as well.
So when we, thank you for that. When we think about sort of when economic security issues came on the radar screen for the Korean government as well as the Korean public. So about when do you think that was the case? I mean, it was a fairly recent phenomenon for the United States as well. But arguably in the Korea case, it even predated the United States. I mean, in the U.S. case, I think it's fair to say for the general public and the generally policy audience, it was really the pandemic that made us very acutely aware of disruptions in supply chains, particularly when it came at that time to PPE, personal protective equipment and things. But so when did it really sort of come on the radar screen for Korea? And if you could tell us sort of how the Korean government has, how this concern about economic security has affected the way the Korean government has looked at this.
I think the triggering momentum for Korea to think about economic security, although at that time we weren't really using the word,
term,
yes,
right, yeah.
was when Japan decided to not export the three goods or the intermediate goods for producing semiconductors. These three materials, which were not really critical, but actually essential. And so the decision, although it was a political decision, I guess, not a purely economic decision, sort of triggered that, export controls could be used against other countries, other trading partners for political purposes. And later, I think, although it was not a deliberate move, I think China decided to stop exports or to control exports of urea, which was an important intermediate, I guess, a material for manufacturing cars. And that had sort of disrupted the supply chain for car manufacturing industry in Korea. And so these incidents triggered the awareness that the stable supply of goods for manufacturing sector is an important issue, and that, I guess, served as key examples of the beginning phases of of becoming more aware of economic security risks for Korea.
Yeah, interesting. As you were answering the question, I thought you were going to go back even further and talk about going back to 2016 and 2017 when China carried out all sorts of economic coercion against South Korea over the THAAD deployment. But that wasn't really a supply chain issue or economic security issue. It was just weaponizing trade. So that's interesting. And so can you tell us like what the Korean government has done to, I think all governments have become much more acutely aware of this, and they've sort of adapted themselves to make economic security, which may have been sort of a much lower priority issue, into sort of a tier one issue. And what has the Korean government done in this respect?
Well, first, we made the control tower in the Yongsan, or the presidential office, to take overall charge of economic security issues, because it involves a lot of ministries and agencies to coordinate their jobs, what they're in charge of, in order to implement these legislations and revise the existing systems to more responsibly react to economic security issues. And so we had this control tower in place to implement Korea's economic security strategy. But more importantly, we made a series of legislative restructuring efforts. First of all, for maintaining stability for our supply chains. And so one of some of the legislative actions that we made were we established a framework act on supply chain stabilization support for economic security. And we also established this act called a National Resources Security Special Act, and also an act on special measures to strengthen competitiveness and to stabilize supply chains for materials, components, and equipment industry. So that was for the supply chain stability side. And also for the promotion of strategic industries, we also made a series of legislations. So we established an act on special measures for strengthening the competitiveness of and protecting national high-tech strategic industries, and also legislated a special act on fostering national strategic technology. And another important aspect was the revision of existing legislations to strengthen the protection of technology. And so within our Foreign Trade Act, we revised this act to strengthen the provisions for export controls. And also, we revised the Foreign Investment Promotion Act to introduce provisions on inbound investment security screening. And also, we also enacted an act on prevention of divulgence and protection of industrial technology. So these kinds of legislative actions were made in place, were taken to promote the economic security strategy, to implement the economic security strategy of the Korean government.
And I think the important thing that you say there is that it was legislation, right? Which means that, even though Korea is a highly politically polarized country and there's a lot of politics between the parties, this was generally, these laws were all being made with the support of a broad political consensus in South Korea.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's also important. That's important to note because there's very little that is not partisan in South Korea, and this seems to be one issue where there seems to be some consensus.
Yes, in terms of economic security, I don't think there is a partisan divide because the issues, regardless of which party is in taking the leadership, the issues that we're dealing with are not going to change.
Yeah, and there was some parallel there, of course, to the United States too, because if there's one thing that you could say there is a through line of consistency between the Biden administration and the Trump administration, it appears to be on economic security. That's one place where there is a through line. And not jumping too far ahead of our questions today, I would assume that that in the case of South Korea, you have an impending election at some point, probably in the next couple of months, that whoever comes into power in Korea will probably still be they may use different political language and things, but they pretty much still be adhering to the same priority on economic security.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that, yes, as I mentioned before, because the risks that we are facing when it comes to economic security, such as supply chain stability and promotion of strategic industries, these priorities are not going to change regardless of which government takes the leadership.
Yeah. And companies, for the most part, are also playing along, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, okay. Great. So let's pivot a little bit to bilateral cooperation between Korea and the United States. Economic security cooperation, as you said, there's been a lot of legislation passed in Korea, particularly with regard to high tech and technology controls in areas like 5G, quantum, semiconductors, EV batteries. The economic security cooperation between the United States and South Korea really advanced quite a bit during the Yoon and Biden administrations. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what were some of the successes and also what may have been some of the difficulties in that period.
As you just mentioned, I believe that the Korea-U.S. bilateral cooperation of economic security under the former administration has been quite successful, despite the difficult situation that we were placed in. As we all know, there has been a series of legislations under the Biden administration, like the IRA and the CHIPS Act, and also strengthened export controls as well. And that actually created tensions for Korean companies doing business in the U.S. However, the Biden administration has been quite cooperative to important supply chain partners and allies like Korea, and has provided specific exceptions or considerations under these measures that actually allowed companies to restructure, to take time to restructure their supply chains without drastically damaging their businesses. But there were also challenges, as you know, in particular, the legislation of the IRA has actually triggered significant concerns for Korean companies because, especially in the EV industry, electric vehicle industry, because, as you know, the conditions attached in order to receive IRA subsidies were quite difficult to satisfy, and our companies were threatened to lose the U.S. market if they were not able to meet these demands. However, we were able to overcome these barriers and to maintain our U.S. market. And with regard to semiconductors, export controls were being strengthened under the Biden administration, which were quite burdensome, not only for Korean companies, but for other companies as well, as far as I know. Although we, in order to be in line with Biden administration position on export control measures, we revised our External Trade Act to strengthen provisions for export controls. But Korea actually is not yet recognized as a country that has the same level of export control measures as with the U.S. So I guess this is why we did not get exempted from the FDPR, the Foreign Direct Product Rule, for applying the export controls on the semiconductors equipment manufacturing against China. That was in December 2024, and we actually didn't get exempted from the FDPR application. However, the good news is that Korean companies could still export the U.S. technology products to countries because we have been grouped together with Group A countries, which actually were allowed to obtain export licenses when needed. And so although we didn't get exempted, we did, the Biden administration actually made leeways for countries, for trusted companies, for trusted allies to be able to receive these considerations in order to continue export. And so under the Biden administration, despite these tightened export controls, important allies like Korea were provided much consideration, which helped to strengthen our alliance relationship against our mutual areas of concern. So.
Let's now. So it's a pretty impressive record. Like you said, there were successes, but there were also challenges during the Biden administration. But of course, now we are here in the Trump. We're 2 months. It's been 2 months. It feels like longer. But it's been 2 months into the Trump administration. And so this is an impressive record. What does the future of cooperation look like under a new Trump administration? I know you're here in D.C. now with a delegation from KNDA of both trade and security experts talking to a lot of different folks in D.C. I imagine that there's both some, trepidation, expectations. So what's on Korea's mind when it comes to thinking about economic security cooperation with the new Trump administration?
I think one of the most concerning difference under the Trump administration versus Biden administration is that there does not seem to be enough consideration for U.S. supply chain partners and allies. And the tariff measures, obviously, such as the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, and the upcoming reciprocal tariffs are actually indifferent to important U.S. allies and economic partners. And so it's very worrisome, especially the reciprocal tariffs, which are scheduled to be imposed after April 2nd. If they are under schedule, actually seem to be another form of trade measure to be used to threaten all U.S. trading partners to address the trade imbalance problem for the U.S. However, this time, I think the focus is more on addressing non-tariff barriers by calculating tariff equivalents to impose these tariffs. And I think the focus is now on doing something about subsidies or other unfair trading practices that the U.S. thinks that their trading partners have been imposing against them. It is also especially worrisome for Korea that President Trump mentioned that Korea imposes 4 times higher tariffs than does the U.S., which is actually incorrect. I think this is based on incorrect sources that Korea, just based on the MFN tariffs.
Right.
And however, when we consider actually the preferential tariffs that are being provided bilaterally under the KORES FTA, actually almost all tariffs have been eliminated.
Yeah, it's almost zero.
Yeah, it's almost zero. And
Yeah.
so when we talk about reciprocity with Korea, I mean, our trade is already reciprocal. And so we don't, actually, when we talk about tariffs, there's nothing to eliminate. And so it's we want to explain to the Trump administration that this is a fact, but I'm not sure if he will listen. And but when it comes to non-tariff barriers, I think it's a little bit of a different story because we have this NTE report that is being published by the USTR every year, and we see a list of trade barriers that the US claims it's facing. We've actually been discussing these issues every year under the FTA committee, and so we already have channels of discussion bilaterally to discuss trade barrier issues. But trying to impose or resolve these issues by imposing tariff equivalents to these non-tariff barriers is a whole different story, and I'm not sure if it's really implementable. So I think it remains to be seen whether it will be actually implemented and whether there is room for negotiation with the Trump administration before they try to implement these kinds of tariffs against Korea.
Yeah, reaction is that I think you're right. Like when he talked about 4 times more, he was referring to sort of the MFN average rate, but that between the U.S. and Korea is 0 because of the Chorus FTA. I do think he does look at the world I think his grievance with regard to this particular issue is universal in the sense that I think he really does view the world in terms of like what's India's average tariff rate, like what's pick any country, like what's their average tariff rate, and then the U.S. average tariff rate, outside of any agreements is it's low, it's fairly low, it's like 2.5% to 3%, yes. And so I think that's where he gets the unfairness idea. And then when he sees trade imbalances, like, Korea's got a big trade imbalance with the United, then it all like comes together for him. But I agree with you 100%. I mean, we're talking about basically 0 tariffs on both sides. But I think probably like a number, he's a businessman, so I'm sure he has a lot of friends in business. There have been, a number of probably U.S. companies that have talked about sort of the non-tariff barriers. I remember early on in Chorus FTA, there was a big dispute between the U.S. and Korea over like interpretation of rules of origin on something like orange juice or something, like from Mexico, or like some element of it was from Mexico, and that was used to protect the industry. And so, so when I sense in the Korea case, and those negotiations are very like difficult, and like it's like trench warfare, really difficult. And so in that sense, Trump is kind of sweeping in with this reciprocal tariff, and I guess trying to create some leverage. But as you say, there's no discrimination between allies, partners, security partners, these sorts of things. And so that's certainly something to be concerned about. So we have an election. I shouldn't say we have an election because we haven't. At the time of recording this, we don't have a constitutional court decision in Korea yet. But perhaps by the time we air this, there may be a decision. But we're talking about a couple of months and then an election in Korea, whether it's a conservative or progressive government. We kind of referred to this a little bit, but do you see any differences in the way conservative or progressive, a PPP or a DPK government looks at the question of economic security? Do you see them sort of carrying it out in different ways?
I'm not really close with political people, based on
You're
my
a scholar. Yes.
Based on my very limited connection or contact with politicians from both sides. Their approach seems to be more genuine in trying to understand what our companies are, what risks they're facing, and what policies we need in place to have in place in order to address their concerns and risks. And so when it comes to Korea's economic security strategy, I don't think there's really that much difference, depending on whether the next government may be more progressive or conservative. And this is because our main concerns and priorities are the same when it comes to economic security, the 3 priorities that I mentioned beforehand. And the fact that the U.S. remains our number 1 ally and one of our top 2 trading partners along with China, is also not a fact that is going to change. And also the fact that Korea is a very highly trade-dependent country, and so we cannot afford to not pay attention to our commercial interests. They are at the same level as with our national security interests, and so this situation is not going to change either. And however, under these circumstances and the escalating tensions between U.S. and China and all these repercussions and impact that these tensions are having on the global economy, I think that we have made careful, slow, but consistent progress in trying to restructure our systems and legislations to put more focus on economic security risks. And to introduce measures that would make us more responsive to risks involving economic security. And I guess, as I mentioned, the main objective of our economic security strategy is to become more resilient to economic security risks, whether they come from U.S. or China or any other country. And that would be mainly through diversification efforts and also establishing new trade arrangements with new trading partners for stabilizing our supply chains and perhaps to maintain cooperative relationships with countries to navigate through these difficulties together. And while at the same time, it's trying to strengthen our domestic capabilities for increasing our competitiveness in key strategic areas. So I think these priorities are going to be the same for the next government, whichever it's going to be.
Yeah. And just to follow up on that, I mean, I think that that would be certainly prudent for either a conservative or a progressive government to think about those sorts of things and to make the economy more resilient, as you said. And I agree with that. In the end, though, there are still two markets that matter the most, right, for Korea, right? It will be the United States and it will be China. We're talking about a lot of the challenges, but there also are opportunities, right, that could be unlocked in Trump administration on, a variety of things. Shipbuilding is one that everybody has talked about a lot. Energy cooperation might be another. There are while Trump himself is unpredictable, sometimes he unlocks things that were never really possible before, and so there may be opportunities there. But I guess, I would ask you, like with China, how do you think, when you think about the future in terms of not just economic security, but economic cooperation and trade with China for South Korea, like what is the road forward? I mean, is it, I know that there's been talk, well, I guess there has been some version of a free trade agreement or talk about a free trade agreement or RCEP but like, what do you see the future in terms of Korea-China trade?
I guess the impact of the rising tensions between U.S. and China has had an impact on Korean businesses doing business in China. And so inevitably, Korean companies facing increased barriers of exports against China imposed by the U.S. are directly affected. And so their businesses, they are actually reducing their businesses in China. They're trying to move out of China because they don't want to be negatively affected. But there are limitations in trying to do that because obviously the Chinese market, they have infrastructures that have low costs, that involve low labor costs, and they have sophisticated infrastructure for at least developing low-tech manufacturing. And also they have become increasingly sophisticated in their manufacturing skills. And so these kinds of manufacturing infrastructure are difficult to be replaced. And although we're trying to diversify our supply chains to countries in the Indo-Pacific area, especially in Southeast Asia, like Vietnam or Malaysia, there are limitations in doing that. And so it's not going to happen in about 2 or 3 years. It's going to be longer than that. And so despite the reduction in businesses, in the number of businesses that are doing business business in China, there are still businesses that have to maintain their operations, factories in China. And so I think it's a challenge for Korea. We know that the risks of doing business in China is increasing. We are aware of that, but there are limitations in inducing companies in changing their business strategies to just move out of China. That's not feasible, obviously, and I think that's the same for U.S. companies as well. On the other hand, not only the tariff barriers, but the export controls. I think it is more likely that export controls will be tightened further against China because of this. I think the Trump administration's objective is to become more strategically independent from China. And so that inevitably involves strengthened export controls. And I think the scope could be expanded to more low-tech technology products. And that could also be bad news for Korean companies, not only for Korean companies, for U.S. companies as well that are trying to maintain their low-tech manufacturing operations in China. And so it's also going to have a big impact. And so inevitably, I guess this is a very difficult situation to navigate through. But obviously, and also the tariffs that are being imposed on Mexico and Canada as well is also going to have grave consequences for Korean companies as well that are doing business, that have manufacturing operations in Mexico and going to the U.S. And so all these trade barriers are sending the message that if you want to sell any products to the U.S., you have to come and invest in America, and you have to build factories in America. And so companies are well aware of this U.S. strategy, and they're trying to meet the demands, but obviously there are limitations. And so I guess we're trying to navigate through these times as much as possible, but again, there are commercial interests involved and limitations. And so I guess that's all we can say.
So I'm not I'm not a trade person, but and I understand what you're saying, and so just like as a follow-up, you described sort of the difficulties and sort of the minefields that Korean companies and the government have to navigate when it comes to China, given sort of U.S. legislation, U.S. things. At the same time, though, I think you would agree that prior to this period when there has been this rash of legislation, Korean companies on their own, without this particular U.S. factor, had their own difficulties in China, right? Having to do with a whole host of issues, most prominently IPR, right? IPR theft being one of them. Now we have this other new paradigm emerging in the United States where essentially it's becoming harder and harder for Korean companies, particularly on the cutting edge, that they're the best path for them to navigate this U.S. legislation and EOs is to, as you said, come in and build, establish a foundry or something here, and then produce the product here. Now, I know this is going to be a very unfair question to ask, but when you sort of compare like the China landscape and environment to this very complicated environment that's being created in the United States. I guess I don't want to make it. It's not an either/or question, but I guess there are different sorts of environments, and I guess what I'm trying to get at is, even for Korean companies, maybe the old way might have been better, like, I can make it cheaper in Mexico and deliver it to the United States. But if that becomes less of an option, there's still a path that is somewhat knowable and predictable, as opposed to like putting all your eggs in the China basket where there's a lot of opacity and unpredictability. Is that like an unfair characterization, or what would you?
I think considering all these changing circumstances and the legislations and the strategies that U.S. government and China is trying to take in these times, it is fair to say that perhaps, well, we need both markets, obviously,
Yeah.
the U.S. and China market, but I guess the focus would have to be different. And when we're doing business or we're trying to engage in economic cooperation with these countries, we have to meet their demands, or else we'll not be able to do business with them. And so obviously we know what the US want, and we know where China is trying to go. And so when we're doing business with the US, I guess in order to maintain the US market, we need to meet the US government's demands, which is they're trying to lift export barriers. So they don't want exports anymore. They want more investments. And so I guess we have to, in order to maintain our relationship with the U.S. in terms of trade or investment relations, we have to invest more if we want. We have to build factories. So I guess since the U.S. is a more advanced market and more technology advanced, it would be fair to say that we would have to focus more on high-tech areas in the U.S. and cooperate in R&D sectors, or engage in cooperation in the shipbuilding industry, which is actually very complicated in a high-tech industry. And also, perhaps if we have the chance to cooperate with the U.S. in the SMR, the nuclear reactor.
Small modular reactors.
Yes. The infrastructure for energy. That would be the areas where Korea could work on. But when we come to China, their desire is to become more independent, and they are also lifting export barriers and trying to be more independent in terms of manufacturing and becoming more competitive. And so I guess for Korean companies, there's a great risk of IPR theft. Mm-hmm. And if we engage, and then because of these unfair trade practices that they have been using, I think there's a great risk for Korean companies in trying to maintain their technology cooperation with China. Mm-hmm. And I guess that awareness has been there for quite a long time. And so China would be a market where our companies would target only the domestic market. In other words, sell to the Chinese market, but not link them to our supply chains with the U.S., because that would be a barrier that we cannot overcome. And so maybe just target the Chinese domestic market and sell our goods where we are more competitive. But it will be more and more difficult because China is becoming more competitive in those areas where we are competitive as well. And so I guess diversification and trying to find other markets is an imperative for Korea to deal with the China issue. So I guess that would have to be a kind of a differentiated strategy for Korean businesses when they want to maintain both relations with both the U.S. and China. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, and I apologize for the tangent there. So let me just finally take us back to the question of economic security. And ask you, so going forward, what do you feel have been the most promising initiatives that South Korea has made on economic security, or what are some of the things you wish that they would do, or that you applaud them for doing thus far?
Yeah. I think that Korea, in terms of economic security initiative, has taken the regional initiative in stabilizing supply chains, especially through the IPF format. And Korea actually took the lead in the second pillar, the supply chain pillar in the IPF, and it provided case scenarios for responding to potential supply chain risks by establishing this system called the early warning system. And so it actually took the lead in trying to stabilize supply chains and respond to potential supply chain risks. But that was under the Biden administration. And I'm not sure if under the Trump administration, the focus would still be on supply chain stability and restructuring the supply chains. It seems to be that under the Trump administration, the new focus is on the America First trade policy. And so in order to work with the Trump administration, we have to match the needs that the U.S. government and the policy priorities that the new administration has. And I think that area would be several key strategic industries like shipbuilding industry and perhaps the LNG energy industry, infrastructure, LNG transportation industry, those areas which the U.S. government thinks Korea has competitiveness and can help the U.S. to become more competitive as well. So these areas, I think, could be promising areas where we can work with the Trump administration to try to overcome the difficulties that we are facing right now with regard to trade.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I mean, really wonderful discussion. Lots of opportunities, but also challenges going ahead, and also not necessarily a lot of clarity either going ahead. So I guess that's what makes it interesting, and what allows us to keep having this conversation. So Dr. Lee, thank you so much for joining us today. For our viewers, thank you for watching another episode of The Impossible State. We'll be back with you soon, and all have a good day.